Basically, a really close friend of Niamh and mine was hospitalised. She was in an inpatient mental health unit, and you can't come and go as you please. Visiting her in that space was incredibly troubling. Our friend was very unwell. We care about this person really deeply, and seeing her in this white, stark space that really reflected back depression and a lot of the negative things you think about yourself just felt like it was completely wrong. This isn't the kind of place someone should be being cared for or treated or recover in. To enter, you go through double airlock doors. It's completely bare and white. It's got heavy chairs that you might be hard to move. It's very aggressive in terms of atmosphere. The noise reflects back on you. You can hear people shouting. The floor is hard, the chairs are hard, everything is hard about it. The edges are hard, and everything's white or magnolia. So there's no visual stimulation. And that very first visit, Niamh and I said, let's try and do something about this.
But about that particular mental health ward?
Just about any mental health ward. We just thought of it as an idea, let's see if we can go to any mental health unit and say, could we do a project where we could see if it could be a bit better than this? And then that started a journey of trying to see if we could get something off the ground. It took us 18 months before anyone let us in the door.
Why?
A lot of people said you can't bring people into an inpatient mental health ward. It's not safe. This is just
artists,
not something that's done.
Decorators,
artists, anyone to do workshops. Where's the data that says this is going to do good and not harm? We just don't have the capacity for you to do this. So actually, some of these, they're obviously kind of valid questions because these are very risk-averse spaces.
Yeah, just to outline that in black and white detail, actually, I'm imagining, pictures hung on the wall, they've got wires on the back, you've got people there who are at suicide risk, right?
Yeah.
There's glass.
Yeah, so no glass, no screws in the wall, nothing that could be a ligature risk, everything has to be scrubbable. And then on top of that, there's that kind of inherited wisdom that things are the way they are for a reason, and everything should be white or magnolia because any visual stimulation is a negative for someone who's got mental health problems.
Yeah.
So there's all those things that we were battling with. And I think whenever anyone goes to hospital, not just mental health hospitals, but most people go in and go, I hate hospitals.
Yes, the smell,
or
the sounds.
The smell, the sounds, the way it looks.
Yeah.
And you go, okay, this is not a warm, comforting place. Whereas most of the people that work in mental health hospitals or in hospitals do a really hard job. They do it for the right reason. They're very warm people, but they're doing it in places that are the opposite. It took us 18 months before anyone would give us a chance. We were told this isn't something that should happen in a mental health unit. You shouldn't be bringing people into an inpatient mental health unit. But an encounter in a pub, talking to someone who knew a medical director at a mental health unit, led us to getting a 30-minute meeting with her. And then that turned into a 2-hour meeting where by the end of it, we managed to have a project. She said, you can work at the Phoenix unit in Springfield Hospital. And we said, we'll raise all the money, we'll come with the artists, and we promise we'll do something really good. And then we spent a lot of time with the staff there and the patients there, and an occupational therapist called Hannah Spreadbury-Troy, who really taught us a lot.
Who did you go to first?
I think the first artist, I think it was Nick Knight. He's an amazing photographer, but also we knew it would help us get other artists if he said yes. We thought we need someone who people recognise and
the live
he's
thing.
really good.
Bono's on board.
If we get him, if we get Assemble and we get Gavin Turk, then other people will go, oh, okay, then they must be legitimate, even though we weren't. So, that I think Nick Knight was probably the person who got things started for us. On our first project, we had 2 artists who we were working with who both had mums who'd been under section in that hospital when they were teenagers.
Wow.
One we knew that was the case, and one was just coincidental. One of the things that they were both saying was that they didn't visit their parents enough, because when they were a teenager, they went once or they went twice, and they said, I just can't do this. So over 6 months, they just couldn't go back to that space because it was very traumatizing.
Yeah.
So, one of the spaces that we did in that first project, and we've gone on to always do, is the family room, because that's often the first encounter, and often for a child as well. When you first go into that ward, how does it feel when you visit that person? Could it be a bit more humanizing than that stale, clinical white space?
Did the hospital like that? Because it's one thing to say, oh, we've got these two young guys, they think we should cheer up our family room.
Yeah.
They probably think you're going to go to Debenhams, do you know what I mean? Well, you're going to bring in a Turner Prize winning artist. There must have been some scepticism about that.
Well, to be honest, they were really open to it. I mean, it was the medical director, Emma Witcher. We said, we want this to be as good as it would be as if it was in a museum. So the kind of one rule we've got is that we don't infantilize anyone experiencing these artworks. We don't do a dumbed down or a hospital grade version of it. We speak with the artist and we go, if you're going to do something, you do it as well as you do it.
So it's original commissioned work.
It's commissioned work. They get
it's not
the
taking
artists
one
get
of their
money.
famous paintings and sticking it in the
No. So they get some they get a small artist fee, there's a production budget, and then Niamh and I at the time, it was just the two of us, so we'd paint the walls, we'd stand with the artist every day. So we were there full time for a good number of months, 5 days a week in the hospital, just speaking to people. It was amazing because we got to spend loads of time in an inpatient mental health unit where, it's not like being a patient, but it is, we do get to go, do you know what, if I could tell this person spends 5 or 6 hours a day in this room, that's an important space. I could tell there might not be enough to do because there's not enough staff. This space is never used, so let's not bother doing that space. So and then also like how individual everyone is, and hearing what people think about art, and then also the fact that 4 of the people in that unit had been to art school, so there's all this sort of creative people that they just haven't done anything for years, but there's still all this talent there as well. We kind of talked to people at the beginning. We said, what do you want to see? And everyone said the same thing, a recovery tree, because that's what everyone's seen in the wards, and they go, that's a nice thing.
What's a recovery tree?
A recovery tree is a kind of hand-painted tree on the wall, and then you put leaves on it that say things about recovery.
Right.
And there's hundreds of them across the country, and it's a really nice thing, but it's not what Hospital Rooms does. And what we learned is when we do the next project, we need to flip it round. We need to do all the workshops at the beginning with the artists, and that will be our kind of collaborative process where we get to, because if you ask someone a direct question, you often get quite a boring answer. But if you're sitting together and you're making something really interesting, we start the project with a big season of creative workshops, spending lots of time with artists before we go anywhere near making an artwork for award.
What kind of thing do they talk about? Because that's an issue too, isn't it? Some people, I imagine, with a very aggressive psychosis, like, don't want to talk about it. They want an escape from it. And other people are really self-aware and are all about their recovery and saying, well, this is what's happened and this is what I'm doing. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's different for every type of ward, because some wards, if it's a psychiatric intensive care unit, someone might be there for 6 weeks, and in the first week that person might be non-verbal, but by the 4th or 5th week you can have a really brilliant conversation about an artwork. Whereas in like a forensic unit, people might have been there 3 or 4 or 10 years. It's very different again, and also those people will be living with the artworks that you make. So the whole idea about it is it has to be very unique for that setting. It's not about saying, what do you like? I think that's the thing, because it's not always about what you like. We need to figure out what is going to be appropriate, so it's not going to be triggering for people. But then what's right for a different space that you have a choice to go in and out of? Maybe like in a games room, it should be about something really exciting and explosive, but maybe in a de-escalation room where you don't have a choice where you're going in and out, is figuring out when you're at that point, what would have helped. So we did one in Croydon. Over all these workshops and all these discussions and doing these workshops and talking about what's interesting, what people wanted was street art. They wanted colour. They want things that reflect like the passion and energy of who they are. And actually, a lot of those artworks just would not be appropriate for a different space. But for there, they were really successful, and people wanted that kind of thing and certain things represented. And then if we work in a mother and baby unit, like for people with postpartum psychosis, what people wanted was very different as well. Like, it was very much about, in an area that people want to sit and be quiet and breastfeed, it was about softness, and often it was about things that soften the space. So it could be about fabrics, it could be about textures. So the artists we work with then could go away, they make their own artwork, but take all these things on board. And before we make that artwork, we go through a whole process of bringing it back to the people who are going to experience it.
And I guess that includes not just escaping how you're feeling, but embracing it as well sometimes.
I think one of the really interesting things about some of the artworks that are made for the hospitals is they're not just about escapism. Sometimes they're about acknowledging struggle and doing it in the right way. So Susie Hamilton's paintings, one she did for a psychiatric intensive care unit, what she got from the workshops is that people did want to acknowledge that they're going through something difficult, but that there is some hope there. So she did this amazing painting of Asami going into the Arctic tundra with this kind of light at the end of it. And the whole thing is beautiful, but it also looks like a struggle, and it looks difficult, but there's something just so hopeful about the painting. I think there's something more complex about escapism.
Have there been challenges then with artworks that, you know, the people in charge of the hospitals frankly don't like?
We have a kind of agreement or contract that says it's not about whether you like it or not. It's about, we go through a really robust collaborative process to make something really interesting and exciting, and your job is to sign it off if it's safe or not. A lot of the wards that we work in are pretty, you know, some of them are pretty much falling apart. If it's really impossible for us to actually put an artwork on that wall, we might say to them, to do this project with us, we need you to do some repair to the space. So we did a project up in Sandwell recently where they replastered the walls and repainted the walls, and that really helped. Sometimes we go in, we'll fix walls, we'll make good as possible. We work in anything from beautiful new builds, like one in Springfield Hospital we've recently done, to some pretty derelict spaces. Sometimes the artwork might not last 10 years, and that's fine.
What reaction have you seen from patients?
Most patients, when we do a project, the ward becomes a kind of creative hub for a little while. You know, there's lots of exciting things going on. There's lots of workshops. There's things going on. There's artists on site. It's generally that energy and atmosphere is a really positive one. For a sort of smaller amount of people, they've been really a big part of making the artwork. So sometimes we have co-created artworks. People like Harold Offway will actually, his artwork will be made with patients. There's one person, I don't think she'd mind me saying, but someone who's now a very close friend of ours who we met on our second ever project. And at the end of the workshop, she was brave enough to show us some of her own photography work. And it was absolutely phenomenal. She's a brilliant photographer, but hadn't had the chance to show it. And we said, well, why don't you come back to the next session and lead it with us? And she did, and she did an incredible job of that. She then ended up doing some volunteering work with us, and she's gone on to win a major art prize for her photography, and I hope we played a small part in that.
I should ask as well, given the state of the modern art world and how artists can suddenly become quite zeitgeisty and trendy, and you've obviously got an eye for working with some great artists, are there installations you've done for £5,000 that are now theoretically worth £500,000 somewhere in a mental health hospital?
So actually there are certain works that if it was sold to a gallery might be in the millions, that we've paid a very small amount of thousands to be done, and a lot of that's through the sort of generosity of the artist to do something so amazing for a hospital.
So is that all contracted? This can't be sold?
It's contracted, it can't be sold.
Right.
So basically the artworks are made for a specific place, for a specific group of people, and they can't be sold by the hospital to make a new wing or fix the roof. They belong to that group of people, or they belong to that sort of wall. And if the ward moves, it has to be destroyed. And I think that's really important. There's something about the value of art that goes beyond the price tag of it. And the artists are brilliant about it. And the thing that I love is you'll get some incredible artists. You'll get Francis McGurn or Michele Jordan or Mark Titchen or Michael Andy who will make something, and they do something incredible. They don't sort of phone it in. They do something absolutely brilliant. And it belongs to this space. And there's a medium secure unit in Norwich that's probably like one of the best cultural hotspots in the area, but it just so happens that there's probably 50 staff and 40 patients that get to see all of that, and it sort of belongs to them, and I think that's great.
I suppose as well, sometimes though, you must hear people walk in and say, perhaps not even knowing that you're responsible for what's there, you know, in the way that people do when they engage, especially with modern art, what the fuck is this? What do you say when you overhear that, or how do you feel?
You know, we're used to it. We get this quite a lot. I think it's mostly when the artwork's happening. You know, at the beginning when it's being installed. One thing that almost always happens: the first artwork we install on a project of 10 or 20 artworks is someone says it's shit. You know, the first days it's going in, and often by the end of the project, those people become like your greatest allies. They're the people who get brought along that journey. But I think there's
Why
something.
is that, do you think? Why, upon seeing lots of the same iterative things, do they change their mind?
Well, I think there's two things. One part of it is that the art world does a pretty good job sometimes of making people feel quite alienated from it. So you feel like you're being taken the mickey out of if it's not something that's kind of easy to say, well, that looks really good. Sometimes you go, are they taking the piss out of me because...
Yeah, why have they done a picture of a fried egg? What does that mean?
I mean, sometimes there's that. But on our first ever project, the Gavin Turk had these two sort of eggs stacked on top of each other that was quite conceptual, and it was very much about, which one's bigger, and it was talking to art history, and actually it was hugely loved. It's been hugely loved by that ward, and someone wrote a poem about the artwork, and you go, this is not like this isn't a decorative piece, really. It's kind of, there is something quite conceptual about it. And sometimes we feel like we're a nuisance. And if there's other problems within the ward, the artwork can be a good thing to put like the problems on, is to go, sometimes these wards look terrible. And then you add an artwork to it and you can kind of say that's the problem. And actually that happens. We see it when a ward's not working very well at that moment. I think the overwhelming response is so positive, but we listen and we like talking about things when people say that's shit or I don't like it, and sometimes you go, well, that's okay, but it's a really interesting thing to talk about. One psychiatrist was telling us that whenever she spoke to patients, she'd go to one of the rooms with an artwork and she'd sit there and they'd start for 5 minutes by talking about the artwork,
something
and the space they're in.
About,
and she said it was a great way of starting a session with a patient, and I think that's where art can kind of be useful.
Yeah, I had a friend who was sectioned in a mental health ward once, and I went to visit him, and it was a similar environment to what you're describing. It was at least in the Cambridgeshire countryside, so there were some glass doors looking out to a view, but there was a lot of looking at a white plain wall, and all they had was a little library of books, old books. And so exactly for the reason you're describing, because you don't want to go in and say, oh, let's talk, I mean, the last time I saw him, he hadn't tried to kill himself. The next time I saw him, he had. It's not a way to open a conversation, is it? What do you reach for? We ended up going for Sharon Osbourne's autobiography. That's what we talked about, because it was just there. And that's what you had, an old copy of Sharon Osbourne's autobiography. You're looking sort of desperate for any stimulus, actually.
Yeah. The NHS Trust now have to contribute 50% at least towards the project, which is a big deal. I mean, that amazing medical director who first spoke to us did say you will never get a penny from the NHS for doing this work. And when we first got 15% or something towards a small project, we were kind of, we didn't say I told you so, but we were quite proud of that. We said that someone from the NHS is buying into this and sees it as valuable enough. It's funny that people will spend huge amounts of money on vinyls to go on the walls that look terrible, but if it's an art project, people are still very scared of what people think about it. Is this a waste of money?
What do you do to answer that when it comes to the NHS? Because again, even if people love this, in the contemporary world we're in at the moment, where it is stretched and not working, people will say, that's lovely, but every penny should be going on patient care directly, and that means physical hands-on medical assistance, not what's on the walls. Yeah,
you got to stick up for it. If you believe in it, you got to stick up for it. It's not, I think the thing is, there's so much money going into so many different things, and everyone always brings it down to a nurse's salary.
Right.
And it's so much about optics. I think like some people get so focused on like where a small little chunk of money is going, if it's the way of sort of complaining about things, that you can be too risk averse, and then nothing changes. I think one thing that we're doing at the moment is we're working on a murals evaluation project with the WHO, New York University, and Norwich University of the Arts, that will hopefully say this: you're not, wasting money, you're saving money. The sort of value on people, but also the value of what this is doing could there is monetary value to it that is above what's being spent on it, because there's things to do on the ward, because we're humanizing people, because the space looks better. That's worth something. But no one will care that a chair costs £3,000, and it's heavy and it's uncomfortable. That I think we've got to stick up for ourselves there.
And you were saying to me just before we came in the studio, so I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this or not, but you and Niamh have been spending a lot of time in hospitals for a different reason.
Yeah. So our son is critically ill, and we've spent a lot of the last 18 months in hospital, and we have a good while to go. He has leukemia, so we spend time in different hospitals, and it's been quite interesting because from that I believe in what we do with hospital rooms even deeper. You know, the environment that you spend a lot of time in really has a big effect on you.
Yeah.
And I think I came away from it feeling even more resolved that we have to make as much change as we can.
So all of the things that you spotted, I suppose, that were a problem in the mental health wards then, that's something, is it, that you're seeing in children's wards now too?
We do, and he's lucky to be treated in an amazing hospital that at some point will have a new cancer centre, but at the moment looks incredibly run down. It's very dark. The spaces are very claustrophobic for a small child, and for us as parents who might spend weeks on end in that sort of small room. It can sort of contribute to some feelings of despair. And as a child, a 4-year-old can be much more resilient than the adults, but it isn't a place that feels warm and comforting. You know, it feels like a clinical space that isn't conducive to making you feel better about yourself or feeling better.
Yeah. And I suppose as well with children's medicine, the point is you've got a young person there who's learning about that clinical experience by going there, and then every time they have to go back, you want them to associate it with something positive that happened last time, not the bad stuff.
Yeah, and the good thing about children is if there's a playroom, then it makes a big difference. You know, I think the thing is we're really concentrating on mental health because it's possibly the hardest place to do this in that kind of health system. This is something that could be translated and should be translated to all clinical spaces.
Is it still something you come up against, management saying, we want magnolia, we want white? And what do you say?
Yeah, we have that a lot. And actually the NHS trusts often have their own colour palette.
Do they?
Yeah, they do. And we've been given them sometimes, and they're often terrible. But I think sometimes there's these kind of wrong versions of art or colour theory where people think blue does this, orange does this, but you go, what blue and what orange? And sometimes they're awful. Most of us don't sit in a completely bare magnolia space, you know. And the way we get around it is, even if we're given an NHS colour chart, is we say the whole space, which is almost why we're called hospital rooms, is the whole space is the artwork. So even if one artwork is, say, for example, a mural on one wall, the rest of the walls are part of the artwork. So the artist chooses what goes best with that artwork, and it's rarely magnolia.